So when there's no expert, a personal injury case commonly relies upon a series of narratives and subjective evidence as well as medical records. So commonly there are narratives such as from the plaintiff or the defendant, how fast they were going, what happened in the accident, and then their subjective report of symptoms to medical personnel. In contrast, when there's an expert that's brought in, they actually look and determine objectively what happened. What were the speeds involved? What was the damage involved to the cars? And from that, we can determine the speed. We can determine how the vehicle responded to the accident, objectively down to the decimal point with regards to speed. And from that we can determine essentially how the human moved in the car exactly, the forces imparted upon them, whether they impacted anything within the vehicle, and therefore their likelihood and expectation of injury scientifically. Where police reports and medical records and narratives sometimes fall short is fundamentally just that. There's a lot of subjective information involved, right? I feel this type of pain. I have these type of symptoms. I reported to the police officer that I was going 20 miles an hour. But what we do objectively and what we do scientifically is we look at objective evidence and facts. So what do we have that is objective? What we have as objective is photographs, right? So the damage photographs of a car accident. So if we have photographs, we can actually determine scientifically the exact speeds of the cars, how the car moved, and from that we can therefore objectively determine how somebody moved within the car, whether they impacted anything, the forces imparted upon their body, and therefore from that we can determine with a reasonable degree of scientific probability whether we would expect those injuries and what injuries would actually be expected, and whether there were any failure points. Did the airbag deploy late or improperly? Did the seatbelt malfunction? Was the person even wearing their seatbelt? All of those things can always be teased out scientifically, as opposed to simply relying on some sort of subjective reports of the plaintiff or the defendant, or what they may have told the police officer, or even sometimes what they may have reported their pain was, right? A 0 out of 10 pain, or a 2 out of 10 pain, or a 4 out of 10 pain is very different for different people. So what we want to determine is objectively what actually happened in the accident. What happened in that snapshot of time? What science can measure from a crash is exactly what happened, right? So when we look at the photographs of a damaged vehicle, we can actually quantify the amount of crush or the amount of damage that was actually present. So as opposed to just kind of looking at it, well, there's damage to the rear or there's damage to the front, we can actually quantify exactly the amount of damage. And the amount of damage is actually reflective of energy, right? So how much energy was actually required to cause this damage? And if we're able to determine the amount of energy, we can therefore determine the velocity that was involved. So how did the vehicle actually respond to the accident? What was the change in speed or change in velocity after the accident? And if we're able to determine velocity, and by virtue of understanding where the damage is actually on the car, we can actually determine the angles, right? So if we know velocity and we know angles, therefore we can easily determine how a human moves in the car. And if we're able to determine how they moved, we can determine the forces imparted upon their body. The most common misperception that attorneys have about injury causation is if a car has a high amount of property damage or a low amount of property damage, it is therefore reflective of injury or non-injury, which is actually not the case. There's actually a scientific study that looked at the relationship between property damage estimates and injury causation, and there's no association. So you may have a situation where there is a lot of property damage and it is not necessarily going to be an injury producing event, versus a situation in where you have very minimal property damage, and rather it could be very consistent with injury. A case where the science contradicted the narrative is, and I've seen it actually more than once, is a chain accident. And what that basically means is that a car has damage to both the rear and to the front of the vehicle. Most commonly, this is the result of one car hitting a car, one car's front hits one car in the rear, and then as a result, that car then hits the car in front of it, right? That's a very common thing, very common in California highways in particular, right? So one case, and it's actually happened a couple times in my career, in where the science went away from that narrative, where it was able to be determined that actually the car that was in the middle actually first impacted the car in front of it, and then as a result of this kind of abrupt stop, then was hitting the rear, right? So as opposed to the liability actually being on the vehicle that was in the back, which is most common, it was actually on the vehicle that was in the middle, right? So that is a very common thing, and we actually can tease that out scientifically. We can look at different things, whether it's the onboard computer or the damage profiles of the vehicle or the damage profile between the rear and the front. And by looking at those things and the damage profiles of the different vehicles, we can determine these changes in speed and changes of angles and all of those factors. And from that, we can tease out those things, that who's actually at fault for this accident, who actually initiated the accident. Bringing objective science completely changes the case, right? If you are going about a case relying on narratives, whether it's what the plaintiff said or the defendant said, or what somebody's interpretation of property damage is, or even sometimes what the police report says, it may just completely result in a misrepresentation of what actually happened. Perhaps that the fault of the accident is deviant than what is suggested. The speeds may be deviant. So when relying on purely these narratives, it can flip the case. In contrast, when we bring in science and we can actually determine exactly what happened, we ultimately get to the truth of the matter. What were the speeds involved? How did people move? How did the vehicles move? How did the body move? What was actually the attributing cause of the accident? And are the injuries consistent? And if we're relying purely on narratives and not on science, we'll commonly get to the wrong answer. So the goal is that we consistently rely on science. We bring science earlier on in the case, as opposed to just bring on experts once the case goes to trial. We need to actually bring on science from day one to have a clear understanding as to what happened in the accident, what were the speeds involved, and whether these injuries are consistent, or whether there's other factors at play that happened in this case. Was the person wearing their seatbelt or not? We need to tease those things out immediately, as opposed to relying purely on narratives.